What do you call it when a black man is forced to work for decades without pay by a white man who beats him with a frying pan and a belt buckles, burns him with hot tongs, and repeatedly calls him the N word? Well, if it was the 17 or 1800s, we'd call it slavery. Today, though, this form of enslavement is called human or labor trafficking, and it, along with sex trafficking, impacts 25 million people each year. Today, we are exposing the ugly truth about how we are all guilty of supporting modern day slavery. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
When law enforcement in South Carolina found John Smith, a black man who suffered from intellectual disabilities, they discovered that J&J Cafe owner Bobby Edwards had enslaved Mr. Smith for over 23 years. Edwards beat and forced Mr. Smith to work for long hours every day without pay, and he forced him to live in a roach-infested small apartment behind the cafe. When Smith's family would come look for him, Edwards made him hide in a freezer. For what has been one of the most horrific cases of labor trafficking in the recent past, Edwards only faces 10 years in prison. Now, as unbelievable as this case is, there are millions of men and women each year in this country who are subjected to labor or sex trafficking. And it's happening in plain sight in neighborhoods across the country, neighborhoods where we all live, work, and play. Here to help us understand the shocking and unimaginable truth of human trafficking is one of the world's foremost experts on modern day slavery. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco. Dr. Orozco is one of the world's leading experts. As I said, she has testified as an expert witness in court. She's rescued a woman who was in a sexual servitude for over 20 years. She's interviewed thousands of perpetrators and consumers of slavery in an attempt to help us all understand this $150 billion industry. Dr. Mehlman-Orozco is also the executive director of Freedom Light and an award-winning author of the book Hidden in Plain Sight: America's Slaves of the New Millennium. Good morning and welcome to the show, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Wow, you literally wrote the book on human trafficking, and I'm so glad to have an opportunity to sit down with you today just to share your expertise and shed light not only on this case of Mr. Smith, but on what is happening in so many neighborhoods across this country. I want to start with that case, though, in South Carolina. This is 2021, and when the headlines of this case, African-American man, intellectual disabilities, forced to work for over 2 decades in this cafe by a man who didn't pay him for his labor, who subjected him to all kinds of physical and verbal abuse. I think the world was shocked when we learned not only about the case, but about the punishment that Edwards faced. Help us understand how something like this can be happening in a town in South Carolina in 2021.
Well, I mean, you've already explained to your viewers and listeners that it is a fast-growing crime. It happens in big cities and small towns across the country. But the reality is, when we're talking of modern slavery, when we're talking about human trafficking, it's clandestine. It's happening all across the United States. But when and if we encounter it, so he's working at this restaurant, there are patrons coming in and out. They likely have no idea that this person is being exploited and what they're subjected to because it's clandestine. It's happening perhaps behind closed doors. He's being told to hide. It is not the overt form of chattel slavery that we once had in the United States. It is more hidden, but it does happen. It is prolific. And the unfortunate reality is that's not the only case where traffickers get to operate with impunity. We have cases across the country where sometimes they're not even convicted of trafficking at all. But even if they do, because of the difficulty in proving these offenses, and because sometimes the victims suffer from what I would term a credibility gap, because maybe they're not a stereotypical good witness on the stand. They want to take plea bargains, or they want to offer plea bargains that come with substantially lower sentences. So when we're talking about what needs to happen in the United States to better combat this issue, we do need stronger penalties and punishments for people that are accused and eventually convicted of these types of horrific offenses.
Yeah, I want to go back though to this case. Several things about it really struck me. First, this is a cafe. So when you think about the owner, John Edwards, who owns this cafe, he's not your typical kind of Hollywood villain. He's a business owner. He's a small business owner, the kind of person that we're seeing lauded, over the last several months as people who have survived, or, who have had, an important role to play in our economy during the pandemic. And he was a part of a larger family, because what we learned from this report is that his family members, came in and out of this restaurant, knew that Mr. Edwards was being subjected, at least they had some knowledge about what was going on, but they didn't do anything either. How typical is it for the villain to be, or the perpetrator to be, someone like John Smith versus, this Hollywood villain that we all think of?
I think that's an astute observation, and that's something that I comment on in my book and a lot of times in my writing. I like to say that I take readers behind the headlines of what trafficking really is. And the average American, when they think of trafficking, they're thinking like something out of the movie Taken, where there's this gun-wielding mobster, this clear bad guy, and you have the virginal innocent victim. The reality is a lot worse. It's an average person that is that is the criminal here. It is somebody who you might encounter, that might be your neighbor, a friend, a family member. It might be somebody that you do business with, but you don't know what's going on behind closed doors. So for my book, I interviewed human traffickers, convicted human traffickers, victims of trafficking, commercial sex consumers, as well as consenting sex workers. And one of the most shocking things that I found in those interviews were how charismatic the traffickers were. They were very eloquent in the way that they spoke, at least how they portrayed themselves, this false persona. So they can outwardly project themselves to be, a law-abiding citizen, a God-fearing individual who is in all other ways and purposes, living by the letter of the law, but behind closed doors, they're exploiting somebody for their own financial gain, and can be very violent when and if that situation's challenged.
Yeah, I want to again go back to this case, because another shocking part of it had to do with the sentencing. So what we learned from the reporting was that Edwards, the perpetrator in this case, entered into some kind of plea deal with the government, federal authorities, and he was sentenced to 10 years and had to pay Mr. Smith, over $500,000. For many, that 10-year sentence was just like a tap on the wrist. It wasn't nearly severe enough when you think about, the torture and the heinous nature of the crime. So help us understand in terms of, put in perspective, that 10-year sentence. Was that average? Was that above average? Was that below average for a case such as this?
It really depends on the circumstances of the case, but I've seen similarly violent situations involving sex trafficking and it's the first offense, where the trafficker's getting 18 months or 3 years. Extremely low sentences, extremely low terms of incarceration for the severity of the crime. So it is something that happens with frequency. I think 10 years, I would put it about average. When you do see longer sentences, most of the time it's involving a minor. The reason why that is because consent is an affirmative defense in trafficking cases. So trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, coercion, deception, or threat for the purpose of exploitation or the exploitation of anyone under the age of 18. The primary defense for a trafficker who's trafficking an adult is they wanted to be here. They wanted to give me all their money. They wanted to do this. And, anything else that occurred were other crimes that carry lower sentences. So for example, he might have said, yes, you can find me guilty of simple assault, but it wasn't trafficking because he consented to it. He wanted to be here. So it is a difficult crime to prove. And that's why a lot of the times prosecutors do offer, I think, more favorable plea deals than we would want.
Yeah, and I'm glad you gave us the textbook definition of what trafficking is, and that key phrase in there being coercion. and which is why the defense of consent is allowed. Because again, when you look at something as heinous as this situation, you have a person with intellectual disabilities, and you have to assume that he didn't have the intellectual capacity to know that he was being exploited. And, he may have thought this was a good deal. He had an apartment and he had a job. But the whole concept of him being, in this case, because it's labor trafficking, the labor board got involved. And obviously in the United States, you cannot employ someone. You cannot force someone to work without paying them wages. That is an offense in and of itself. And you are liable and responsible for wages for that person.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I did want to bring up why trafficking. So modern slavery, how did this come to be an offense in the United States, right? It really was codified in the most modern form with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. But if you're looking at why that act was passed, there was actually a case in the late 80s where it involved persons who suffered from mental disabilities, who were enslaved on a farm, that were forced to do, pornographic things, that were beaten. They were not, the offenders in that case were not found guilty of forced labor because of the coercion element, because they said essentially slavery or forced labor, as we once knew it, it had to be more physical force. Like, you're chained, you're physically forced to be there. You're not allowed any kind of freedom. And the coercion aspect, it wasn't part of the definition. So those people were eventually acquitted and found not guilty. So the change in the law that we saw from the TVPA was to actually include that element of coercion and deception, and some things that are more mental forms of recruiting and exploitation, as opposed to the consistent physical abuse that we saw in chattel slavery.
So just to be clear, you're saying up until 2000, trafficking as we know it wasn't even considered a crime. There wasn't a statute that was specific, that allowed prosecutors to use to go after traffickers?
Well, we did have forced labor laws. We also had what was called the Mann Act, which was passed in the early 1900s, that talked about what sex trafficking is. But in the modern form, and what we have, the tools that we have to currently prosecute, they did not exist until the year 2000. So I would say it expanded the definition in the year 2000. But we're still able to prosecute modern slavery, but just in fewer circumstances. And so we needed a lot more in those cases. But as you can see, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This law in 2000 just gave the prosecutors another tool in their toolbox that they could use to go after traffickers, which brings me to my next question is, again, in this case of Mr. Smith, it's such a horrible story, but at least this perpetrator was caught, sadly took 23 years to bring him to justice. But how frequently in a case, and we'll separate the forced labor from the sex trafficking because I want to talk about those separately, but let's say in these forced labor cases, how frequently are the perpetrators actually caught and prosecuted? Is that common or uncommon?
That's a difficult question to answer. And the reason being, if you're it's a very clandestine crime. So we have people and we have organizations like the Department of Labor and ILO and others that estimate hundreds of thousands of victims in the United States. But if you're actually looking at trafficking cases that go through the criminal justice system, it's maybe a couple hundred or 1,000. It's not very many that come with trafficking charges. And then of those trafficking cases, and I talk about this in my book, of those trafficking cases where you see, a big headline, 150 arrested for trafficking, there are, I would say, a small percent, I would say maybe even less than 50%, that actually end in trafficking convictions. But as far as giving you a hard, reliable, empirical statistic, I can't do that because of the lack of data. So anybody who's giving you a hard number, that is misinformed, and it's just not particularly valid because of how clandestine, how hidden, and how many cases go unreported. I mean, even just looking at data on crime, the leading data collection on crime is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. They didn't even have a data point on trafficking until 2013. That shows you how recent this phenomenon is, how recent we're actually addressing it, but also the misidentification that goes. So depending on who you are, your background, or the circumstances of the case, you have victims that are frequently erroneously criminalized. For example, in sex trafficking operations, they're prosecuted as sex workers or as co-conspirators. So the misidentification, erroneous criminalization, it is a prolific issue that further impedes our ability to quantify this phenomenon in a reliable way.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, some of the different forms of trafficking, because again, in that case, that was a man who's forced to work, Mr. Smith forced to work in that cafe in South Carolina. But, give us some other examples of how trafficking takes place.
It manifests in so many different ways. So under the umbrella term of human trafficking, we have two, I guess, larger subsections. You have labor and sex trafficking. Underneath labor trafficking, you can see it in domestic servitude. You can see it in cafes and restaurants, as this case illustrates. We see it in the agricultural industry. A lot of agricultural farms that bring in legal guest workers on legal visas have faced allegations of labor trafficking and deception and fraud used to bring them, promising high wages but never actualize once they get here. We see it in nail salons and massage parlors. We see it in construction sites, even door-to-door solicitation crews. That was one of the more recent forms. Door-to-door salespeople have been known to be labor trafficked. So there are many different ways labor trafficking can manifest. Sex trafficking, you can have gang-controlled sex trafficking, child sex trafficking. You can have trafficking within the pornography industry in some cases, and some allegations suggest. You can have sex tourism, both the civilian sex tourism and military sex tourism. So we actually do have tools in the United States that if you travel abroad for the purpose of procuring commercial sex services from a minor, which is trafficking, you can be prosecuted back here in the United States for those crimes. So there are so many different ways in which it manifests. I've seen some allegations of even other forms of more peripheral sex work, of labor/sex trafficking in strip clubs. So I mean, it can happen in so many different ways. One of the things that I like to say when I'm teaching about this topic is every person, every viewer on your show, every listener on your show has likely encountered a victim, or they're actively using the products of slavery in their day-to-day lives. So even if it's not something that originates here in the United States, even our imported goods, textiles. I know the chocolate industry, there's a documentary called The Dark Side of Chocolate that talks about the horrific child abuse in really it's tantamount to the chattel form of slavery of what we knew it was prior to the 13th Amendment, of how they're using these kids to source the cocoa that makes our chocolate. So I think it's important for people to understand how prolific the issue is, how underreported, but even as this case exemplifies how even if it's identified, the alleged offenders aren't necessarily getting punishments that fit the severity of their crime.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about, how widespread it is and how all of us unknowingly probably have participated by purchasing a good or supporting a store. I know I read an article where you talked about the nail salon near your home maybe was a front for some kind of trafficking. Tell us about that experience, because, if you're a woman, you probably have been to a local nail salon, and a lot of men go to local nail salons.
Well, so it's important to understand that it's difficult to identify. So one of the sources that I turn to, and that actually law enforcement uses, are some of the commercial sex consumer review forums. And so these are websites that I don't know if you want me to name them for your viewers or not, but they're websites that are available online, where commercial sex consumers really detail what they are alleging that they received, illicit commercial sex services. And if you look at some of those websites, they do include nail salons, they do include massage parlors that your viewers might have patronized. But one of the caveats to that is, one, they're anonymous, and two, it's, hearsay, so you can't necessarily use that in a court of law. So as far as whether that's suggestive of whether you can use that to definitively say whether somebody's involved in commercial sex or sex trafficking, absolutely not. But I know other researchers like myself, as well as law enforcement, do use it to catalyze investigations, but also as a proxy for quantifying, how prolific this issue is.
So help us understand. I want to help make sure we're understanding this. So you're saying you can go to a local nail salon. If you think there's something going on there that may be untoward, there's some websites that you can go to, look up and see. There may be some chatter on that website about your salon, about sexual activity that's happening in the salon. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Okay. And some of them do require a username, password to actually see the review. But at the very least, you can go there and see somebody has posted about my nail salon 17 times over the last year. So, different people have posted 17 times over the last year, last 2 years. And if it's one person,
these sites, give us they're
would you like? Okay, so one of them that I mentioned with regards to the nail salons and massage parlors is called rubmaps.com. And I think it changed where it was being hosted after the SESTA and FOSTA was passed. So it's being hosted overseas. It's out of the reach of law enforcement. So Rubmaps is one. Another is called USA Sex Guide. And I think it's usasexguide.nl. And that lists and has reviews for massage parlors, but also it's important to understand that, yes, this is hearsay. These things might not be verifiably true. You can't use it in court, but I have personally used those sites to catalyze investigations that were found out to be true. So case in point, in my book, I detail how I was actually just editing the book and going through some of the sites and some of the quotes that I took from these anonymous commercial sex consumers. And I found one individual who had posted about an advertisement that he responded to. And he said, this woman suffers from mental disabilities. She is being exploited, I think, by a family member. I'm not going back there because I think she's a victim. This is what the commercial sex consumer did. He put a link to the post that had her phone number listed and where she was staying at. And this was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So as I was, editing my book, hundreds of miles away, I called the local law enforcement. They responded within 2 hours, had her in custody, and everything this man said was true. She did suffer from mental disabilities, and they were looking into investigating the exploitation. I don't know what ended up coming of that case, but at least they did pick her up, and they did get her in the hands of service providers.
A good example of see something, say something. So if you see something untoward,
Yes.
say something, contact local law enforcement, get involved. I do want to ask you, Dr. Orozco, we've been talking a lot in this country about race. We're in this moment of a racial reckoning, over the last year or so, and help us understand, even in the context of human trafficking, the role of race and the racialization of victims in the broader scheme of human trafficking.
So it's important for people to understand that the racialization of the criminal justice system of crime as a whole, we know that's been a systemic and prolific issue for a very long period of time. It has affected trafficking as well. So if you're looking at the origination of the term trafficking, it actually came from this idea that white women were being enslaved, which coincidentally came almost not too long after the 13th Amendment. They kind of shifted focus from chattel slavery to say, oh, well, white women are being enslaved, so they called it white slavery. And so I have actually a few books here, I don't know if your viewers can see, where it's talking about white slaves. So white slavery was this idea of white women who were being brought into the commercial sex industry, who were being exploited, some of them kidnapped, some of them orphans, they were children. So initially the way that we addressed that here in the United States was changing the age of consent, but then we passed the White Slave Traffic Act, the Mann Act in the early 1900s, I believe 1910. But if you're looking at how that law was criminalized, who was criminalized, you had men who were of status being brought in and prosecuted for sex trafficking, for white slavery, simply because they had a white wife. Case in point, if you look at the case of heavyweight champion boxer Jack Johnson, an African-American man, he had a white wife, he was prosecuted. And I actually have the original news stories that covered that prosecution. And they said some of the things he did, not only did he have a white wife, but he also disseminated pro-miscegenation material like love knows no race in my affair with a golden brown man. This man was convicted of sex trafficking, and it didn't end there. Sex trafficking laws continued to be applied in a racialized fashion. I have some other magazines and materials. So this article, White Slaves in Black Harlem, was used, and you had articles like this all the time that were used to support segregation. During World War II, Japanese white slavers were used to support the idea of the need for internment camps. And we've seen that continue across the decades, but in the most modern form, we still see that to this day. So one example that you probably remember from the media, do you remember the case and the story? It got national media attention of the DC missing teens? The black and Hispanic girls that had gone missing. And there was this media hubbub about why they weren't doing enough about it. And there were some allegations that it could have involved trafficking. The police quickly, said, no, it's not trafficking. But I was on the other hand saying, even if it's not trafficking, these girls, even if you're saying they left consensually, that they're runaways, they're at high risk of being trafficked. You need to treat them as a person in need of services, as a potential victim, as somebody susceptible to trafficking, because even if they're a runaway, that's a person that needs help. Now, that same week, if you look, and I talk about this in my book, that same week that story came out, where they were dismissing these DC missing teens, these Black and Hispanic girls, that they were dismissing the likelihood that they were being trafficked. That same week, there was a story that also went viral of a white mom who posted a viral Facebook post that said that she thought her kids were going to be trafficked because a guy was walking around them in IKEA, in the middle of the day in IKEA. I was quoted in that story as well, and I said, that's not how trafficking happens. This isn't the movie Taken. They're not physically grabbing kids in the middle of a store. It's possible, but just highly improbable. But the amount of credibility given to that story over the possibility that these young girls were being trafficked, I think was astonishing. And that dichotomy, that contrast within a week time, I think exemplifies how, depending on who the person is, depending on their background, we give them more credibility of allegations of trafficking. And people need to be aware of it. And it needs to be something that we address in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation now Dr. Lillian Agbeyegbe. I think I got it right. Agbeyegbe. I'm going to butcher her name. I'm going to call her Dr. Lillian. She's a researcher. She's a data analyst, and she's working as an impact and data analyst at Polaris, one of the nation's leading nonprofits working to end human trafficking. Good morning, Dr. Lillian, and welcome to the conversation. I know you've been listening in, and I wanted to specifically address with you this whole racialization issue. We heard Dr. Mehlman-Orozco talk about how it matters who the victim is and this whole credibility gap that exists. I also want to talk about victims, particularly of sex trafficking. Many times we'll hear the women and the girls say that they're not being held against their will. There's not that element of coercion, yet they have been brutalized by men mostly. They've been giving their money away to the men. They've been forced to live in a certain apartment or a certain, a house, so they don't have the freedoms to move about. But yet they don't identify themselves as victims. How often does that occur with respect to sex trafficking? And then specifically as it relates to women of color?
Oh, thank you very much for having me here today. So I work with Polaris. We are a data-driven social justice movement working to reduce, prevent, and to end sex and labor trafficking here in the United States. Now, to the issue of Smith that we're talking about and the role race plays in trafficking, you find out that what happens is a trafficker usually steps in to provide something that people don't have. And when you look at the context of people who are lacking things, either housing, employment, or things like that, you usually find out that these are people of color or minorities. And this is why you see this young girl. So what usually happens in cases of sex trafficking, you find what is called a befriending, the Romeo trafficker. These young people are looking for relationships, either because they don't have it at home. Maybe their parents are working so many jobs and they're not at home to bond with the children. So there's that loneliness, there's that need to feel connected to somebody. The parents are also not at home. Maybe they're spending a lot of time on the internet or they're going out. And these people meet them and then they tend to offer them this connectedness that people are looking for, this belonging that people are looking for. And that's why you find that they sort of have some allegiance to the person and they don't even recognize they're in a sex trafficking situation. Sometimes you say to them, you know, you're in a sex trafficking situation. And it's like, no, I'm actually just doing this because he says to do it. But he's actually asking you to sleep with multiple people so that you can have money to meet your needs. That is, you're really doing sex in exchange for money or something of value. And that's usually what sex trafficking looks like. But because of the limited knowledge of what sex trafficking is, people don't readily identify that they're in a sex trafficking situation. And people find themselves in this situation because they are gravitating towards the trafficker who is supposedly providing something that they need, either it's housing or relationship or that sense of belonging that people are looking for.
Yeah, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco, help us understand the shift, even in our culture and our laws around sex trafficking, because it wasn't so long ago that we referred to women who were sex trafficked as prostitutes, and there were criminal laws that penalized the conduct of women who exchange sex for money. We have the classic images in movies of thinking the Julia Roberts, the Pretty Woman. Yes, the Pretty Woman movie. Here she on Hollywood Boulevard, her and a group of women who are literally stopping men in cars, getting in cars, but yet they're constantly worried about the police because police would come and do sweeps on Hollywood Boulevard and arrest these women who were called prostitutes. So now, in the thinking, and particularly around the legal issues, are we thinking about those women differently? Are they still called prostitutes? Are they called sex trafficked victims? And how is the criminal justice system treating them?
Well, okay, so first, it's important, depending on the quote unquote expert you talk to. Some people do conflate prostitution or sex work with trafficking. They think that it's one and the same, and that everybody who is engaged in sex work, they're being coerced or deceived or defrauded or some way exploited or brought into it, either from societal pressures or other things. I do not ascribe to that notion. I do think it's a distinct crime and it's a distinct activity. And I think that there is such thing as a consenting sex worker. So you brought up the case or the example of Julia Roberts. If you remember that movie though, so they were independent. They were keeping all of their money, but in the beginning of the movie, they talked about this pimp, this guy, Carlos, that would take all of the money and that was physically beating. If they were working for him and turning over their money and being physically forced or deceived or coerced, that would have been a trafficking situation, but they were consenting. They wanted to do it by their own volition. In a more modern sense.
I want to be more nuanced about this.
Sure.
So when we talk about consent, let's first of all be clear, we're talking about adults. So kids can't consent. So you're 16 years old, you're 17 years old. Even though you may think you're grown, you can't say I'm consenting to have sex for money with a man. It doesn't work that way. You're not of legal age to do that. But
let me pause you right there, because again, there's some nuance here. I agree with you that should be the case. If you're under the age of 18, that should be the case, that you should not be arrested and convicted of any sex work related crimes because you're not old enough to consent. And essentially that's consistent with what's in the letter of the law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But does that happen all the time? No. Kids are still criminalized for sex work. I can give you actually I think you're going to find this example very interesting. So when we get off this interview, look up the case of Inri Erica S, Aarica, last initial S. This case was out of California. It was a 17-year-old girl who had been sex trafficked on and off since she was, young, had forced abortions, like just a very horrific story. But because she was engaging in survival sex, because she didn't have somebody actively exploiting her when the cop picked her up and solicited her, she was not only arrested and convicted, but that conviction was upheld on appeal. And do you want to know who it was prosecuted under? Kamala Harris.
Really? Okay. All right. I'm going to look that case up because I work with a lot of public defenders who work in the LA County, criminal justice system, and they are often representing young girls under the age of 18 and trying to, get them into diversion programs and get them out of the criminal justice system. And I have one friend who talks a lot about, she says she knows they've lost the case when the girl, the teenager shows up with a new $5,000 Louis Vuitton bag. She knows that the pimp has gotten to her, has given her this bag, and that any efforts to separate are going to be more difficult. But great for bringing that case up. Definitely going to take a look at it. But let's go back to your distinction between consenting sex workers and sex traffic victims, because that's what we were trying to drill down on. So you said you believe that consenting adults who work in the sex business, sex workers, are fine. Yeah, and in fact, I think I read you said those folks should be decriminalized, that they should be allowed to do that without criminal penalties.
Yes, and I distinguish legalization from decriminalization. So I don't think it should be legal, but I do think it should be decriminalized in the sense of, police better use their discretion, where if it is truly two consenting adults, maybe it's not a prosecuted offense, but they still have that to investigate on whether, because again, it's hard to distinguish. It's difficult to distinguish somebody who's truly consenting versus somebody who's being deceived or defrauded.
And I'll ask you, Dr. Lillian, in your work and the work of Polaris, do you all see that distinction between, consenting adults who work in the sex industry versus, women over the age of 18 who are sex traffic victims?
Well, in the National Human Trafficking Hotline, what we do is we get calls from people who are in different situations. And like she was saying earlier, the letter of the law says if you're under 18, you really can't consent. Now, the people who say we're doing this work because we choose to do it, and we recognize that. But if you put in the context of racism, which we spoke about earlier on, the people who are going into this work because they have a need, she was talking about survival sex, and that's what happens to some people. So the situation at home is not favorable or something, and they run away from home, yes, or this person lures them and says, I'm your boyfriend, and goes out, and they need to survive. And so they're engaging in this work, or they turn to sex work as it is, as a means to make ends meet. And that's why the diversion programs have their value. If we're able to provide services for people, they're able to provide housing, we're able to provide training, we're able to provide the support, the safety nets that society puts in place to keep people from falling through. Traffickers will not be able to access them because those traffickers are short.
But Dr. Lillian, I think I'm asking a different question. I understand those workers who are working, as you call survival sex, and they need support, they need housing, they need resources. But I'm saying, does your organization recognize that there are some women, 25-year-old women, who are making a choice, who don't say, that they're being coerced? They're saying, I like the lifestyle, I like the money.
Absolutely. We recognize that there are adults who can say, this is the choice that I have made. I've had all my choices and I'm deciding that this is what I want to do. Yes, there are people who are sex workers by choice and they're making that choice by themselves.
So Dr. Mehlman-Orozco, what I was trying to understand was, has there been a shift in the law as it relates to those women? That we just identified a class of women over the age of 18 who are making a conscious choice. If that lady is, Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, is she still being arrested and charged for the crime of prostitution?
So currently, yes, in most jurisdictions, yes. But if you look at nationally, there is a movement towards decriminalization. So I think you might have seen just recently the prosecutor, I think in Manhattan, Cy Vance, I think there was a story, I was interviewed for it. He has decided to decriminalize not only consenting adult sex work, but also I think he wasn't prosecuting erotic massage either. So there is a movement towards decriminalization, which is is actually consistent with the recommendations from Amnesty International and others, including myself. It's not legalization, but it is decriminalization. The reason why that's important is because, one, it is difficult to discern a consenting sex worker from a victim of trafficking. And to that effect, you did have many instances where victims of trafficking were being picked up and criminalized. And that's one of the reasons why over 50% of states, prior to this movement towards decriminalization, over 50% of states had what's called a vacator statute, which provides post-conviction relief for erroneously criminalized victims. So if a victim was picked up, arrested, prosecuted, convicted of prostitution, and then she was later found to be a victim, in certain jurisdictions, you can get that expunged. Not all, and it's a very, very difficult process. But it was a prolific issue. But now you're seeing, to prevent that from happening in the first place, you are seeing not only individual prosecutors deciding not to move forward with those cases and taking a stance of decriminalization. But I believe Kamala Harris actually made a statement prior to her being elected that she was in support of that on a national level. And then just one more thing to give you some examples that are not fictional, that are real of who we're talking about when we're talking about a consenting sex worker. I'm going to give you two names. One is Norma Jean Almodovar. She wrote a book called From Cop to Call Girl. She literally was a Los Angeles police officer and had the means and choice to do whatever she wanted. She chose to be a sex worker. She wrote a book about it that was published by Simon & Schuster in the 90s. That's one example. Another is an author by the name of Melissa Garrett Grant. She was a very prolific journalist, well-published. She wrote a book called Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work, and she supplemented her journalism income with sex work. Those are two examples of women who are not being exploited, who are not being used, who are not being sex trafficked, who truly are consenting individuals that chose to engage in the commercial sex industry. They are not victims of trafficking. They should not be treated as such. And these women have banded together and they are actually demanding, quote unquote, rights, not rescue.
Great point. And thanks for bringing up those examples. Dr. Lillian, I'll ask you, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco talks about this distinction between decriminalization and legalization. Is that a distinction that you and your organization supports?
The distinction we make is the people who are doing this work. So there's decriminalization, and we look at it in full decrim and partial decrim. So full decrim is saying that sex work should be decriminalized and there's nobody who should be penalized with it. But we recognize in Polaris that the people who are choosing to do this work, and if somebody says that this is the work that they want to do, their own decision, there's no pimp anywhere, there's nobody who's forcing them. They have a right to make that decision, and there's no reason for law enforcement to arrest them. And in fact, we had a report that came out on vacatur a few years ago saying that which of the states are doing well with vacatur, because when they have these records, it stops the ability to move on and do other things in their lives. So if somebody has been arrested for prostitution or for anything related to prostitution, any crime, they should be able to vacate those laws and they should have the opportunity to move on with their lives.
I want to focus now, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco, on children. We've talked a lot about women over the age of 18, but we also know that children are very vulnerable. COVID-19, kids are spending an enormous amount of time, even more time online. And one of the places that a lot of traffickers, sex traffickers look for kids is online. How has COVID-19 impacted this whole trafficking movement, or I shouldn't call it a movement, but trafficking numbers? Have we seen an increase in kids who have been targeted online because of COVID-19?
So just one more point before I answer that question. So for your listeners and viewers, I think it's important to better distinguish what we're talking about with legalization, full decriminalization, partial decriminalization. Legalization means it's legal. Anybody can do it. Law enforcement cannot look into it. The reason why I am not in support of that and other researchers not in support of that is because there actually was a study done in places that have legalized sex work. And they looked at it and basically they were examining whether we saw a replacement effect where the illicit market was replaced by the legal market. which is what they had hoped for. But what they actually found, there was a scale effect, that the illicit market, sex trafficking, expanded, and there were more people being victimized, particularly in European countries. So in places in Europe where you do have legalized sex work, for example, the FKK clubs in Germany, you do have still situations of women being trafficked there. And because it is legal, law enforcement do see some challenges with fully investigating it. When we're talking about full decriminalization, most of the time we're talking about it's still illegal, but if it's involving consenting adults, we really don't prosecute it. And when we're saying full, we're talking about we don't prosecute it not only for the sex workers, but for the commercial sex consumers as well, the men buying the sex. When we're talking about partial decriminalization,
Johns, we used to call Johns. So.
Yes. They're called, we call them Johns. They call themselves quote unquote mongers or hobbyists. That's what they call themselves online. So you learn something new every day.
Yeah, thank you. I'm like, I need a whole new dictionary for all these hobbyists. Oh my goodness.
I have actually a whole glossary of terms in the back of the book. So partial is just talking about the decriminalization of only the sex workers, which is what they're doing in New York. They're still criminalizing the commercial sex consumers. So I wanted to just make that point clear first.
And thank you for clarifying that, because I was thinking of the same thing in terms of legalization, and we've seen that with marijuana. The legalization of marijuana doesn't eliminate the black market for marijuana. So I would imagine that, and that study proves that out, that if we legalize sex work, it won't eliminate the underbelly, the dark underbelly of sex workers. And you probably still have lots of women who get trapped by these traffickers. But let's talk, I'm running out of time.
About COVID, yes.
I'm a children's rights advocate, and we know children are so highly recruited and targeted. So what's happening with children around trafficking in light of COVID-19?
So I think, one, there's just not a lot of data out there, but from what I see as far as more qualitative anecdotal trends, I do think that you're going to see an increase in victimizations, increase of persons at risk. You're having kids that are spending a lot more time online. You're having parents that, I'm a parent myself with 3 young children doing the virtual schooling. My kids are upstairs on their Zoom calls right now. And parents are getting burned out. And as your other guest had alluded to, if you don't have a lot of oversight, if you're not seeing what they're doing online, if you're not seeing who they're connecting with, it does open up the possibility of them connecting with somebody who might exploit them. But to that point, I think it is really important. And actually, this would actually be my first disclosure. I'm working on some children's books to kind of to better socialize how trafficking happens in an age-appropriate, kid-friendly way. And the reason why is because a lot of parents, they're teaching their kids stranger danger, beware of the stranger, beware of, somebody that you don't know coming up in a car. But the reality is that it's not just trafficking. All forms of crime are more likely to be committed by somebody whether it's an acquaintance or somebody that you know intimately. So I think that it's important for them to understand the idea that sometimes the bad guy can come across as really nice and friendly. And so the series of books that I'm working on will actually socialize that concept. But I think parents need to imprint upon their children that sometimes, if somebody's being overly nice and maybe, the parents taking their phone away, the trafficker says, "Oh, I can get you a phone. I can take you to the mall. I can give you a ride." These individuals, and as the other guest had alluded to, they are very charismatic, but they make false promises to fill whatever void you have, whether it's your physiological needs like shelter, food, shelter, water for runaways, whether it's your need for love and belonging, feelings of safety, kids who are at risk. We've seen domestic violence cases go up, child abuse and neglect has gone up, and you're having fewer teachers being able to, report those incidents, building your self-esteem or offering opportunities for self-actualization. These traffickers are making those false promises. The kids are believing it. So I think the risk is there. It depends on how we respond to it.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up some of those warning signs. And Dr. Lillian, do you want to add any additional warning signs that parents in particular should be looking for that might, that should raise alarm for them?
Yes, first I'd like to say that Polaris just put out another report about the post-COVID case where we looked at the data that's reported to the hotline. And as you can imagine, there's a decline in cases that are coming from on-street activities because people can't go out. But there's been an increase in cases that are reporting online. And so one of the recommendations of that report is calling to tech people who have the ability to monitor what's going up online, monitor the young people. The parents might not be able to be there, like your guest was saying, that the kids are upstairs. But what are the safety features that you can put in place to make sure that young people are not being targeted online? But in terms of talking about, things that parents need to know, I think that's important for people to step away from this fact that the trafficker is somebody that's way out there, somebody that you do not know, somebody who's the stranger, somebody who's going to put you up in chains and lock you and throw you up in the car. People are being trafficked right under the nose of their parents. Sometimes the parents are actually the ones doing the trafficking. So there's what we call familiar trafficking. People are being trafficked in their homes by members of their family. So it's just really educating people, providing support. Let the school authorities be educated. So if that child is being trafficked at home, the child is able to go to school and say something to a person in authority, and that this is what's happening in the house. And really to know that it's in exchange for, they may not get the money themselves, so they might not feel that something else is going on. But the parents, the neighbor, the family friend, somebody is collecting that money behind their back and making them do this thing that you do not want to do. So just know that, I spoke to somebody once who was saying, oh, my parents will make sure we come home by 6 p.m. But by that time, they'd already had sex with a number of people already. So thinking that it's when it's nighttime and it's okay for your child to be out at the neighbor during the day without really know what's going on there, your child may actually be being trafficked. That's not a common thing, but it's just one of the things to know is that it's not always a stranger. It's not always somebody that you do not know.
No, that's really good advice. And as we're closing, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco, I want to ask you, I know you interviewed over 2,000 victims. You've interviewed, tons of consumers as well, these perpetrators. Is there a case that sticks out in your mind, like the worst example of trafficking, whether it's, forced labor or sex trafficking?
I mean, one of the, if you can't tell from this conversation that I am so impassioned on this work, the way that I talk about it, it impassions me because I am very much a social justice advocate. And I think that, it's giving a voice to those that are unheard and that are treated oftentimes as disposable people. I think that there are so many cases that are horrific, and each of them speaks to me in different ways and brings out that passion in me to advocate, not only just for, because I think there are so many people that are anti-trafficking that, we passed a law. No, I want effective laws that have meaningful, measurable impact for preventing these crimes, for protecting the victims and survivors, for giving them resources so that they become independent and don't get re-victimized, and prosecute with meaningful convictions the actual bad guys, the traffickers. So I'm very impassioned, but if I would say one of the cases that I think I will carry with me, it's one of the first offenders that was ever sentenced to life in prison for sex trafficking a minor. His name was Carlos Curtis. He was prosecuted in DC. He picked up his victim she was a runaway. I think she didn't know her father. I think her mother was addicted to drugs. She was being raised by an elderly woman. She was 12 years old, walking the streets of New York by herself. Could you imagine? He picked her up, brought her to a pet party, gave her food and shelter, and offered to help her out. Next thing you know, he's saying, you're going to be walking the streets and we're going to be selling you for $100 a pop, brings her down to DC. The reason why that case speaks to me is because when she was picked up, when law enforcement identified her as a victim, there was no one to pick up this little girl. So instead of going with like a social worker, she was brought to a juvenile justice facility where she was sodomized by 2 inmates and later detained as a material witness. And I don't know, and the sentencing report says she did not avail herself for treatment. That case will forever stick with me. That kind of the horrific nature of her victimization, the re-victimization after she was correctly identified as a victim, she was re-victimized, potentially erroneously criminalized after. It is something that happens far too often, and I think that case will stick with me.
Wow. Horrific. And I'm sure there's so many other stories of young girls like that. Dr. Lillian, a last question for you is, we started the show talking about this forced labor of Mr. Smith in South Carolina, and the hundreds of millions of people around the country or the millions of people around the country and really around the globe who are victims of some form of trafficking, and how pervasive it is even in our own communities right here in the United States. I saw a report that California and Texas, New York are states in particular that have high incidents of trafficking. What is it that we should know, those of us who don't want to participate, don't want to be unknowing co-conspirators in this modern day slavery? What are the 2 or 3 things that we should know as we shop, as we go into our local communities, about what may be happening behind closed doors?
One of the things we encourage is people to take advantage of their proximity to know the story. So when you think about Smith, for instance, he got his case was exposed by a co-worker, but this was after he had Edwards had stopped paying him for 5 years. So during that 5 years, were there not other co-workers there? Did they know that something was going wrong? You'll think also that people have annual checkups. Did Smith go for his annual checkup? This is somebody who has a disability. Did he not access healthcare services in that period of 5 years? Was there no way of his healthcare personnel engaging him and knowing what was going on? So you look at those things. What we say to people is, know the story, take advantage of your proximity. You might look at somebody and think that all is well, but another group of people who are in labor trafficking in the country's domestic workers, if you go to somebody's house and they have a cook, and the cook is at work for some reason you have to go there early in the morning, is at work at 6 a.m., is at work at 9 a.m., that's over 8 hours. So is somebody working all of that hours? And if you employ the person for one task, be mindful. If you employ somebody as a cook, don't end up making them the dishwasher and may end up making them a bartender or something, because if you give them more tasks without reviewing their salaries, then you're ending up paying them actually maybe like $2 an hour or less than that. And you're violating them if you seize their passport, if you force them to do things and put them in a position where you threaten to report them so that they're afraid to leave, or you don't give them the means. They don't have the means. They do not earn their own money. And in Smith's case, he wasn't earning any money, so he didn't have any opportunity to have an account. So how is he going to think about leaving? He's living in this house that they provided for him. So without providing all of those services, look around and see the context. Is this person living in this place for free? Do they have an account? Are they working? Are they getting promoted? Do they have access to healthcare services? Can they go and come as they please? And when something doesn't add up, and usually it doesn't add up if we look well enough, if we stop looking for the person who's in chains and who's under the bed. But if we begin to look at the person who seems to be doing a lot for less payment, or who's not in a position to go and come as they will, then something is really going on.
No, excellent points. And last point for you, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco. We go into nail salons every day. We go into our local grocery stores. We buy clothing from stores, and we know the textile industry is rife with trafficking. What's the one biggest thing you think we should be looking for in our daily encounters?
I think that there are some resources that give lists and grades for different companies as far as what they do to combat exploitation and trafficking within their subcontractors, within their primary materials, how they're being sourced. I think, for example, one simple thing that you can do with regards to where you buy chocolate, what kind of chocolate you buy, things that are free trade, that are bean to bar, are I think you can better have a peace of mind that it wasn't sourced with slave labor. But the reality is you're going to be paying a lot more. The cost of that is it is more costly. In particular with textiles, I know that there are different businesses that go into greater detail, for example, of what they do to combat the issue. An example of which is Patagonia. But again, it's very expensive. So I think that what you can do is, educate yourself on all the different industries in which it affects. Question if you're, getting a shirt for $5, what needed to happen in order for that price to be as low as it is, and whether you want to financially contribute to that type of an industry. But as far as your day-to-day activities, I find that in the identifications of actual cases that turned out to be trafficking, it's simply having a conversation with people, talking to them. If they allude to the fact that they have been deceived, defrauded, coerced, and in any way exploited, I think that should raise some red flags. So one of the examples I gave you was door-to-door solicitation crews. The next time I had a door-to-door salesperson, I just talked to her. Where are you from? I'm in Virginia. She was from North Carolina. I said, oh, that's kind of far away. How many people are traveling with you? Where, and just started asking her questions. Turns out she was, there was a lot of red flags of exploitation. She wasn't allowed to eat. They took the room key, unless she made a certain quota. They took room keys for people. Some of the people were homeless. They abandoned some of the people. I've even talked to people who work at, who are former homeless that work at some of the secondhand stores. They've told me situations of them being picked up and used and abandoned in unfamiliar cities. It's simply about talking to people and understanding what their life is and what they're willing to disclose. But as your other guest had alluded to, sometimes they don't self-identify and they're not going to disclose. So it's about making yourself available, making that information available. I know Polaris and Department of Homeland Security and National Center for Missing and Exploited Children all have hotlines where you can, if anything, just give them that number. Give them, I know a good resources for your viewers, Department of Homeland Security. If you go to the Blue campaign, they have free tags that have the hotline number that you can just request it. They'll mail it to you. Carry a bunch of those in your purse and give it out to somebody if you think that they might be in an exploited situation. They might not self-identify at that point, but when they're ready, they'll have the resource to reach out to.
Wow. And that number, if I can give it out, is 1-888-373-7333. You can reach the hotline by phone, by text, by email, online web form, or by chat.
Thank you both so much. We're going to definitely post that information, make it available to our viewers. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I've learned so much, and I know my viewers have as well. I just want to thank both of you women doing amazing work, giving a voice to the voiceless and helping exploited children and adults around the country and around the globe really regain their independence, their dignity, and everyone's entitled to that. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Mehlman-Orozco. Her book is Hidden in Plain Sight. Make sure you pick it up if you want to better understand what's happening in terms of human trafficking around the globe. Thank you, Dr. Lillian, for the great work you are doing at Polaris. Again, we're going to share these resources because we want people to know how they can get involved, how they can help. Again, such an enlightening conversation. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Again, thank you to my amazing guests. I love these conversations when I get to learn so much about, again, a topic. This is what the special report does. We just go deep into these conversations, things that are happening in the news, these big headlines, and then we peel the onion back. We peel the layers back. We go behind the story to help you understand. In the case of Mr. John Smith, that was one man, one African-American man who was forced into labor in this cafe in South Carolina. But it turns out he's a part of a much, much bigger criminal enterprise. And so today we got to expose the ugly truth about that enterprise. And it brought back to me memories of being myself. I was at home one day working from home as I typically do, and I got a knock on my door, and it was actually federal law enforcement agents, and they were doing an investigation of my neighbor, and they were asking me if I saw women, particularly Asian women, coming in and out of my neighbor's house because they believed that there may have been some kind of forced labor happening with domestic workers on the block that I lived in. And fortunately, I had not seen that kind of activity taking place, but glad to see that at least there was an investigation. Hopefully my neighbor wasn't involved in any kind of labor trafficking. But as we learned today, it's not the villains, it's not the guys that look like bad guys on television. It's, you know, people in our communities, it's people in our own families. Again, a hotline number for anyone that knows someone or may suspect that someone is the victim of trafficking. You can call 1-888-373-7888. We're going to post that number on our Facebook page and get it out to viewers as well. Just some quick words to live by before I get out. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. See something, say something. Today, human trafficking is the second largest and fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. And as you heard my guest say, this is modern day slavery. And there are more slaves today than at any other time in our history. They are hidden from view. You don't recognize them in the back kitchen, in shops, in gas stations, and in hospitality industries across this country. They are also tucked away in so many of the fields and the farms that are a part of this country. These modern day slaves are not in shackles, but in many cases, they are beaten and they are violated, and they are often told that they are worthless. 1/5 of these modern day slaves happen to be children under the age of 18. So that means to me, and I hope it means to you, that we all have an obligation. We have an obligation to these children. We have an obligation to these victims. We need more policy. We need more protection. And we need more prosecution of these traffickers. And we all need to do exactly what I said at the beginning. We need to say something if we see something. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we are all in this together.